strip mine that opponents say threatens the health of this critically important wilderness. I'm joined now by three people deeply familiar with the Okefenokee and its value. Logan Cross, chair of the Sierra Club of Northeast Florida. Welcome, Logan.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you. Mark Woods, Florida Times Union columnist and author of Lassoing the Sun, A Year in America's National Parks. Hey, Mark.
Good morning.
And in just a minute, Joshua Marks, we're going to be joined by him on the line, Atlanta-based environmental attorney and longtime advocate for the Okefenokee. Logan, I'm going to start with you. The Okefenokee Swamp dominates our border, but
Right.
The mining issue has not always dominated headlines. Why should people care about this issue?
Well, there are a lot of reasons that people in South Georgia and Northeast Florida should be very concerned about this. I'll be glad to go through a number of items if you will allow me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go for it.
Well,
It's what
one
we're
of
here
them
to
that
talk
I think that they should consider is the Okefenokee Swamp as the headwaters of the St. Mary's and Suwanee rivers. And the bulk of the water that flows southward out of the swamp goes to the Suwanee, but a large portion also goes to the St. Mary's River. And the St. Mary's River water level rises and falls depending on the amount of rain that's in the swamp. Now, there is some thinking that if the mining is allowed to proceed as planned, that it could breach the eastern kind of boundary of the basin that contains the swamp, allowing for an outflow of water. Well, if that happens, it's conceivable that the St. Mary's River could become essentially a glorified creek. So that should be of concern to people. Now, a lot of people who've lived in the area and some people who do travel into Clay County and Bradford counties will be able to see that the areas where phosphate mining and sand mining was allowed to go unrestrained for many years, some of those areas now look like moonscape. And the other thing that's happened down there that's very visible, the many lakes that dotted the area around Hawthorne and Keystone Heights, many of them have dried up or are drying up. This has prompted the state to go so far as to fund a project to pump water from Black Creek to Lake Brooklyn through a 17-mile pipeline.
And this is in the Keystone Heights area of Florida, right?
I'm bringing this up as an example of this is what can happen when you do unrestrained mining. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we fear happening up in South Georgia. The other thing that I would finally like to make along those lines that I think should be relevant for the people in this region is the Floridan aquifer that serves this area on down South Florida also extends up into South Georgia. And the Okefenokee sits atop that aquifer. If, let's say, again, the basin that contains the swamp is breached in some way, that might change the amount of water that the swamp does contribute to the aquifer. So that, in turn, could eventually affect some people in this area who depend on that aquifer.
Mark Woods, Logan points out some rather technical reasons why we should care. But you have covered, the Okefenokee also just from kind of a human standpoint. What is there to appreciate about this place? Obviously, you've done a lot of written appreciations for wild places around the country in the work that you've done. But what's special about the Okefenokee?
You can argue that there's no place quite on earth like it. I mean, that's kind of it's up for UNESCO World Heritage Site now. That's been moving forward. It's basically been a 40-year process, but it's getting close, and that might happen later this year. And because of its size, 700 square miles, and preservation, it's a really unique thing that we don't think that much about. I think because it's across our border, and it's and people hear swamp and they think what's the big deal. This is not mining, but I don't think we have to look too far. Just look to our south, to the Everglades, to see, what can happen if you damage something that's worked naturally for eons, and how hard it is to, or even impossible to go back to what it was. So I think that's, I don't understand all the science of this, but the people who do, when I read like the Fish and Wildlife Service says this poses a risk of permanent and irreversible impacts. To me, that's that's a big red flag right there.
when
So,
scientists are saying that in
yeah.
their evaluation. So the strip mine would be adjacent to on the east side of the Okefenokee Swamp. Joshua Marks, I want to bring you into this conversation. This would be a strip mine for titanium, which is used to whiten products, everything from paint and plastic, but also, as you informed me, Oreo cookies.
That's right, Ann. When I started working on the threat of mining next to the Okefenokee back in the 1990s, I was shocked that we were putting one of our greatest natural treasures at risk for a junk food product, one that I happen to have loved growing up. But yeah, if food products are one of the main uses for titanium dioxide, so in addition to Oreo cookies, the M's on your M&Ms are whitened with titanium dioxide. And one thing, Ann, I just want to clarify, there's a lot of confusion as to the location of the mine. Trail Ridge, which is where they want to do the mining, is actually the eastern hydrologic boundary of the ecosystem. So it's inside the swamp ecosystem. So the mining company will tell you the mine is outside the refuge, but that's a political boundary. The ecosystem that's at rest, the mine is inside, it's right on the edge. And that's a really important point for your listeners and viewers to understand.
And Joshua, this is not the same size as a project that you first got involved in the Okefenokee over, but it is similar in terms of, what will be happening there. In the late 90s, corporate giant DuPont sought to strip mine 38,000 acres in the same area. By comparison, this seems a lot smaller.
Yeah, and that's correct. DuPont tried to mine the entire eastern boundary of the swamp. And I was part of a team that fought successfully to block that. And the current mining company learned from that experience. And so even though ultimately they want to mine virtually the same total number of acres, instead of trying to do it all at once, they're trying to do it in these little bite-sized chunks in the hopes that the public and the regulators will be fooled into thinking, well, a 500 or 1,000 acre project at a time won't be so bad. But when they cobble all these mini projects together, the impacts will be devastating.
So Twin Pines is the company that's behind the new project. They've asked to mine. Initially, they wanted 2,500 acres or so. They've since scaled that back to just 582. Logan, why does that not reassure advocates for the Okefenokee?
Well, oftentimes those are just kind of like step one in the process. They may kind of guise it in, this is a test or this is just a preliminary step or whatever, but oftentimes that often expands thereafter. It's kind of akin to getting your foot in the door, and you maybe just get started and you say, well, you see, the damage was not pronounced, so we're seeking permission to expand this. So that is why we feel it's very important to stop it from even beginning, even from the test phase. And that's largely the area of the concern. And one other thing I would like to make a point related to that is Twin Pines is kind of cloaking this in. It'll bring some much needed jobs to an area that probably could use some jobs. But the problem with this is the jobs that they will add will, for all intents and purposes, be temporary. I mean, you don't see any mining and phosphate jobs that much in Clay County and Bradford County anymore. Once they've exhausted the minerals and gotten what they can, they will leave, and those jobs will disappear as well.
So we're talking about a strip mining proposal near the Okefenokee Swamp. Have you been to the swamp? What concerns or questions do you have? You can join our conversation by calling us at 904-549-2937, or you can send an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also message us on social media. Josh Marks, why is there a special urgency now? What has been happening just in the last month that should give people who are concerned about the Okefenokee concern?
So within the last few weeks, and Georgia regulators released draft permits for the initial 582-acre mining proposal. and the permits are devastating. What the impacts that will happen to the swamp from the mining are as bad now as they have been for the last several years. So we are calling on folks in Georgia and Florida and really throughout the world, because the Okefenokee is a world-renowned ecosystem, to reach out to Georgia regulators to ask them to deny the permit. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the Georgia legislature has been wrestling with this issue for the last 3 years, and a good bill that would prohibit mining on this trail ridge in perpetuity has been blocked for the last 3 years. And instead, last week, a bill was introduced in the Georgia House of Representatives that would fast track the issuance of permits into the future and would override judicial review of those permits. And so we are calling on folks in Georgia as well as Florida to reach out to the governor and Georgia legislators to say no to that bill and instead say yes to the bill that will protect the swamp forever.
You know, it seems like that bill that you're talking about threatens to confuse the issue, because there are a lot of people concerned about these permits that have been issued. The bill is structured as a moratorium on mining, but as you say, other elements of it would fast track future permits, and it wouldn't prevent mining on the Twin Pines site.
That's right. The moratorium is designed to confuse people, and we're calling it a wolf in sheep's clothing because the moratorium would not apply to this existing 500-acre proposal. It would not apply to other types of mining technologies that are threatened to be used on Trail Ridge. And the moratorium really isn't necessary, Ann, because Twin Pines has said that it would take them 4 years to complete this first phase and that they had no intention of filing for additional permits until the first phase was done. So if it's going to take them 4 years to complete it and the moratorium is only 3 years long, you can see clearly that the moratorium really doesn't do anything. And it's confusing people into thinking, well, the day has been saved, when the small print in the back of the bill forces Georgia regulators to expedite issuance of permits, and it restricts the ability of the judicial system to correct permits that are issued improperly, which we think is unconstitutional. So we think this is a really, really bad bill that threatens the Okefenokee for decades.
Mark Woods, Georgia's Environmental Protection Division released their draft permit late on a Friday afternoon earlier this month, and reporters at least know that's notorious time for dumping news that people want buried or don't want to see reported.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate folks like Logan and Joshua staying on top of this, because it's had many twists and turns. I wrote about it in the fall and had to kind of refresh myself on, it was started out kind of in the Army Corps hands, and then, now it's in the state hand. This is kind of the, Logan and I were talking about this beforehand. This is kind of the end, feels like the end of the road. So it's, do you stop it here or does it happen? And yeah, kind of back, I was thinking too, when you asked me why it's special. So, not the science part of it. I've been up there. If you go to Stephen Foster State Park on the western edge, it's a beautiful state park, and it's an international dark sky park, which to get that designation, you have to have kind of these amazing dark skies where you see stars. We kind of forget how many stars there are until we go out west. This is a place in the east where you can experience that. The wildlife and the refuge is just, if you get out there in a boat, do a boat tour or a canoe, you're just kind of in another world. It's an amazing place to visit. So if people haven't spent a day in the Okefenokee, I highly recommend it.
The size is massive. It's, about larger than the city of Jacksonville or thereabouts, which you can imagine.
Yeah, 700 square miles, and I think we're 840. So yeah, almost the size. That gives a good visual.
So this issue, as you say, Mark, has been batted around from agency to agency. It's gone from being evaluated at the federal level to now basically being in the hands of the state. Logan, I think that there's some people that would think, well, the state lawmakers are closer to this issue. They'd probably be a little more attuned to the environmental um, sanctity of that place. But that's not always the case.
No, that's not, and that's why it takes, I guess, advocacy groups and entities like yours bringing attention to these issues, because a lot of times they go unseen, and a lot of times when someone in the legislature just really maybe views this as just a bunch of swampland that should be utilized for other purposes or something, and therefore when they see a proposal that could bring jobs to an area that probably could use some jobs, they get all on board. And so they start viewing it from a different lens than someone who appreciates it for its natural grandeur. And looking at it deeper as to what is the role does it play in the ecosystem of not just the immediate area, but the region around. Like we were talking earlier, let's say that the St. Mary's starts drying up, or its water levels changes. That impacts people in St. Mary's and Fernandina who are accustomed to certain water levels coming from the St. Mary's. It impacts people who maybe kayak and boat parts of those rivers or have docks on the rivers. So it's a type thing that a lot of people do not look any deeper than just what's on the surface. And so we try to encourage people to do that.
And it could be not just flow, but of course that affects water quality.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And so the impacts could be more substantial than a lot of people think.
We've got a call, Tim from Orange Park. Good morning, Tim. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Yes, good morning. I was just wondering, does the Okefenokee directly or indirectly affect swamps all the way down to Gainesville? And it just seems to me that this whole thing reminds me of the Pogo saying, "We have met the enemy and they is us." Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Mark, Josh, I want to push that question to you if that's all right. In terms of the downward impacts, I know that Logan mentioned the rivers that are impacted. Of course, the Suwanee heads through a lot of places in Florida. What are the impacts downstream, downstate, I guess, in Florida from this?
Yeah, so the Okefenokee is part of a greater ecosystem that includes the Osceola National Forest that extends down into northern Florida. At one time when there were discussions about reintroducing Florida panther up into North Florida, the Okefenokee Osceola ecosystem was a targeted area for such relocation. So it really is important for you, Ann, and your listeners to understand this is not just a Georgia issue. This really is a Georgia-Florida issue. And even though Georgia has exclusive jurisdiction over the regulatory regime right now, it's super important for listeners like that caller and others to reach out to Georgia and say, hey, this is not simply something that happens within your borders. This is affecting us as well. And so that's why I'm glad that there's understanding and appreciation from folks in the Jacksonville area that this really is a Florida issue as much as it is a Georgia issue.
And I want to note, we did reach out to the Twin Pines mining folks to see if they wanted to participate in today's show or to even phone in. They declined, but they did send a statement. It said in part that their plan will be, quote, fully protective of the Okefenokee. And the president of that company said that scientists who publicly oppose the project, who've had 4+ years to present credible science to back their claims, never did. He says that they have instead manufactured a lot of misinformation and continue to create drama. Josh, what have the scientists said, and what administrations and agencies do they represent?
Well, Steve Engel, he's the president of Twin Pines. He's simply false with that statement. There are over 90 scientists from Georgia and around the country who have signed repeated letters to Georgia regulators saying that they've closely and thoroughly analyzed the hydrologic impacts of the mine on the swamp. And there's uniform agreement that the mine will draw down the swamp's water levels tripling the frequency of drought with potentially devastating impacts on the swamp. The leading scientists are independent. They're not hired by the mining company. They're not hired by any regulators. They're not paid by any environmental groups. They're doing that because they believe in sound science and they believe in the protection of the Okefenokee. The lead scientist on this project is one of the foremost hydrologists in the country. He's from the University of Georgia in Athens. And I just want to point out the fact that Twin Pines has a history of misrepresentation and law violation going back to the beginning of this project, Anne. So, when they throw accusations out, you really have to consider the source and the track record. They misrepresented multiple times on their own permit applications about the nature of the land that they controlled, and they had repeated violations of state law governing their exploratory drilling, for which they were recently fined $20,000 by Georgia regulators. They've committed violations in Northeast Florida at their prior mine site in Stark, and their affiliated companies have caused multiple problems in Northeast Georgia. So that is a company that has no business operating in the middle of a desert, much less next to a globally important resource like the Okefenokee.
So the Trail Ridge, which is the target for mining, it's actually kind of the eastern border of the swamp and looms about 50 feet higher than the water levels in the Okefenokee. But this ridge is an ancient barrier island, and it stretches actually from Stark up into Jessup, Georgia. So it is a far-reaching, resource for people that have used it for mining. And Logan, as you've said, Stark is a good example of
Right.
what this process looks like. Not everybody has been to Stark and not everybody has seen. So explain to us what you're talking about.
Well, for those who are unfamiliar with it, the phosphate mining in Northeast Florida was very prominent for a while, and as well as sand mining. And that mining got started at the lower end of the Trail Ridge system there and went on for years. And like I said, one only has to. Now, people who grew up in this area were intimately familiar with a lot of that when it was going on. And but if somebody is wanting to know, all they have to do is take a drive down to maybe to Kingsley's Lake or some other the few existing lakes, and they will see that the landscape has been pretty much irreparably changed, and it is not returned to its natural state. So once the harvesting is done and the natural resources are largely exhausted, then the mining companies move out, the jobs go with them, and the touted benefits of it disappear. And that's what we fear for southeast Georgia as well. Now, I do also want to make a point that's kind of tangential to this. For some reason or another, Florida and northeast Florida is beginning to think of South Georgia as its dumping ground. There is a huge landfill not too far from there in Carlton County. There's also coal ash that is brought up from Puerto Rico through the coal generators down in Puerto Rico comes through the Jacksonville port and is hauled up to South Georgia for disposal.
And some people might remember a barge that was loaded with that coal
Right.
ash basically went adrift and lost its entire load of coal ash on the shores of Mayport.
Right. So I think that we as citizens should bear a little bit of responsibility for this and think a little bit about what are we doing to this area of the country.
We've got a call, Jesse from Fernandina Beach. Good morning. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Hi, how are you guys?
Very good. Go ahead.
My question is for Florida residents that are wanting to express their opposition to this. What would your recommendations be as far as reaching out and how we can, facilitate that? And I will take my question off there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jesse. It's a good question. Do people in Florida have any say in this matter, Logan, since this is a Georgia issue?
Yes, I'm glad that she posed that question because We put a number of links where people can utilize the links to both comment on the proposed permitting. We have those links in our Take Action site on our website, but we also have it on our social media sites, and it'll appear prominently in our newsletter that'll be coming out on the 1st. That'll provide them with some options, but we do hope to keep providing options as they emerge where people can comment, but they can also attend and participate in virtual meetings related to this. So a lot of that is listed. If people are interested, they can go to those locations and find some of those options. And we would certainly welcome engagement and involvement by people in Florida, Northeast Florida, and on down through the state.
Joshua Marks, people have commented on this. Most of the comments have been in opposition, very little support for outside of lawmakers. And this is not just an environmental issue. This is a political issue. Money plays a role. How does it impact this debate?
Yeah, so money is at the heart of this debate, Ann. The mining company has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in campaign contributions and lobbyists to put pressure on the governor and all the senior decision makers in Georgia. Governor Kemp alone has received nearly $100,000 from the mining company and its lobbyists. And that, we believe, is the only reason that Georgia regulators have entertained this project for so long in the face of massive scientific evidence of impact, in the face of massive legal concerns, and most importantly, hundreds of thousands of comments against this project that have been submitted over the last 5 years. And it's atrocious when you hear about our government leaders, in essence, selling out one of our country's greatest natural resources to industry that not only has never done this type of mining before, has never operated in Georgia, but has such a terrible track record. It just seems to be such a dereliction of duty and a violation of the public's faith. And that's a really important issue for us to spotlight, to try to hold the governor and other legislative leaders accountable.
Mark Woods, just very briefly, there have been a lot of battles that have been won and some lost. What do you think are the odds on, saving the Okefenokee from this particular mining plan?
Yeah, I don't know. They've been following it much more closely than I have. It feels, it's back and forth and back and forth. It does feel a little frightening now. And like I said before, the concern, I think, was summed up in that long U.S. Fish and Wildlife statement where they said proposes a risk of permanent and irreversible impacts. You don't want to do something that you can't go back and change. And again, the Everglades is a great example. And water and hydrology is so complex. I did a column a couple months ago about Carr Smith, who passed away since then, but he described it in kind of layman's terms for me. Just said picture the Okefenokee as this giant shallow plate, and it's full of water. If you compromise an edge of that plate, what happens? And the mining company will tell you we're not going to compromise it, but what if they're wrong?
Well, Logan Cross with the Sierra Club, attorney Joshua Marks, Times Union columnist Mark Woods, thanks to all of you for being here and talking about this important issue.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.